All right, awesome. I see we're live on YouTube also. That is looking good. So
all right, so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to one of the public forums on the public hearing draft. And so this is just one of many public forums that we're having on the land development code rewrite specific to the public hearing draft of the code. So we've had a couple of others this week, and we're going to have another one tomorrow. So if you missed out on any of the others, we're going to really be presenting the same material here as we have in the other forums. So the only thing that's really going to be different is any questions or comments at the end of the meeting. As you join us, feel free to add comments into the chat box through the Zoom, and we'll be getting to those at the end of the meeting. So similarly, those of you who may be watching us live on YouTube, feel free to add some comments there if you're not in the Zoom meeting directly. My name is Brian Crooks, and I am the Interim Planning Services Manager with Richland County. And with me speaking today is Mr. Tommy DeLage, the Assistant Zoning Administrator with the county. And so what we're going to be doing today is really going over an overview of the land development code rewrite, specifically the public hearing draft, looking at kind of the why we need the rewrite, and also what are we looking to accomplish through it. And then from there, looking at some of these big differences between the old code to the new code, highlighting what some of those big ideas look like and some of those different points. And then looking at some of the other articles that have some minor differences. So things that are going to be different, but are still kind of relatively similar from the old code to the new code. And then wrapping up with any comments or questions that we receive throughout the presentation. And so as I mentioned a minute ago, if you have comments, if you have questions, feel free to add those into the chat box, and we will be addressing those as best as possible at the end of the overview. And so, why are we doing the land development code rewrite? And so for a couple things, but really to meet the vision for growth and development that the county is looking for. And so specific to this, the current land development code last received an update in 2005 with minor edits since then. So the current code that we have is outdated and does not allow for development that meshes with the county's vision for the future, whether that is rural protections, development of suburban centers, or really just being easy to access and understand on a whole. And so what the code rewrite is really the key measure to implement the county's land use policies. And so the rewrite sets forth regulations that are going to be in line with best practices to meet the vision of the 2015 comprehensive plan. And so looking at a variety of things through that, but ultimately you're really trying to get to ensuring that the vision for growth and development is something that we're able to actually achieve with the tool that is the land development code. And so the public hearing draft is available, which is what we're speaking on today. It has been for a few weeks now. So it's available for review through a couple of different ways, one of which is through the project website, which is www.weplantogether.org. It can also be accessed through the Community Planning and Development Department's webpage, as well as hard copy viewing in the county administration building at the planning counter, or through the various library branches. We have provided hard copies to them. So those folks that, visiting the library is going to be easier. It's going to be more accessible. You could go there, view the copy that they have at the libraries instead. So a variety of ways that you're able to view that text and really get to know it going forward. And so looking at also having multiple engagement points throughout the land development code rewrite process. And so, this has been an ongoing process for the last several years now, starting back in the beginning of 2017, at the beginning of when all of this began. And so we've had multiple engagement points previously, and so we were looking to have some now within our current step in terms of looking at this public hearing draft as we move towards the adoption process. And so this meeting, as I mentioned earlier, is just one of many that we are holding on the public hearing draft. And so for those of you who are not able to attend this meeting, they are being live streamed and recorded on the county's YouTube page. And so if you are interested in watching the others, it's going to really be the same material, but questions and comments that are getting addressed, there may be a little bit different in terms of what those look like. You can also learn more about the code in a one-on-one setting, meeting with staff directly to ask questions, make comments, or get clarification on the code in a one-on-one setting here in the county administration building. And you can do that by way of contacting staff directly via email, via phone, and our information is going to be at the end of this presentation, or through the county's website through the appointment scheduler application. And so you're able to really engage with staff and with the code in a variety of ways to provide that feedback and learn more about what all the code entails. And so again, looking at some of that why for the code rewrite and really looking at 5 major objectives with what we're looking to accomplish with the new code. So one of which being a user-friendly code. And so with the new code, looking at consolidating and reorganizing the land development code structure, more graphically rich. So we've included a variety. So we're looking to include a variety of illustrations, diagrams, flowcharts, tables throughout the document in each of the articles, using more down-to-earth language throughout the document. So having much less legalese, much less complicated language than what we currently have. So it's easier to understand, easier to grasp, but also looking at things like standardizing procedures for applications and submittals, so that way generally you know what the process is going to look like for every application type. And so one of the main objectives, as I kind of alluded to earlier, is implementing the policies of Plan Richland County. And so that is the current comprehensive plan that we have, which helps guide growth and development. And so one of the things that we're looking to do in terms of implementing that is providing a greater range of housing type and housing choices than historically has been possible, easing the ability with which to undertake infill, redevelopment, and reinvestment for a variety of properties, enabling the preservation and continuance of rural character and working lands with appropriate zoning districts, and then having more open space, better conservation of land, and incentives for green practices, and then also ensuring compatibility for military operations to continue and avoid any of those encroachments. So how do we look at the military installations and ensure their viability going forward, but also how are they good neighbors in those surrounding properties and good neighbors back? So another objective that we have is aligning zoning districts and uses with current best practices. And really what this means is having new districts, having new uses, and having new use standards that allow for development in different contexts versus a one-size-fits-all approach that is currently able to be achieved under our code at the present. So really having more variety in character and variety of context where appropriate for those specific place types that are found throughout the county versus just kind of suburban and suburban. Another objective is really to bring these development standards into the 21st century. And what this means is modernizing parking standards, having required minimum open space throughout developments, including new design and form standards, which really has these new development standards that will help provide for quality development that all county residents can agree upon. And then kind of lastly, as another objective is going to be ensuring green development practices are found throughout the code to help provide for more sustainable development, but also a more sustainable Richland County overall. And so moving here next to really look at what some of these major differences are with the land development code. And so how are we looking at things changing, what some of these differences look like. And so one thing that we have tried to be really clear in terms of our language as we talk about the rewrite is that the rewrite isn't just looking at doing an update or making revisions to the land development code, but the changes that we're making are significant enough that we're looking at the code being something new entirely. So having an entirely new code than just simply having an update or revisions to what we currently have. So even where we carry things forward from the old code into the new code, there's still enough deviation to where it is something new elsewise. And so going to be looking through some of the various articles found throughout the code and what some of these differences are and what you should be looking for and kind of expecting with the new code going forward. So Article 2 includes the administration article. And so one thing here is really having it being more approachable, easier to understand, and graphically heavy. And so a major change provides for a standard set of review procedures across all applications where we have exceptions or additional processes for specific applications. Those are noted elsewise. And so what this really does is has a much more user-friendly and easier to understand process than what is currently listed in the code. And so you may have multiple processes or procedures in terms of each of the different application types, but instead we've really standardized how some of those reviews look and what all that entails. And so, you know, generally, for the variety of application types that the county has, it's going to follow some type of similar review no matter what the application is. And so where we do have specific additional review kind of frameworks, those are noted in addition to what some of those general steps look like. And so really here, along with that, is a major departure in the overall look, feel, and approachability of the code itself. So really looking at a variety of graphic elements such as tables, flowcharts, diagrams, that's really going to help, help the everyday citizen understand everything a little bit better who's trying to get something done. So it's going to help the everyday citizen, but it's also going to help those of us who deal with the code on a day in, day out basis, just because it's going to be much more easier flow, much more easier understanding. And so just overall better setup overall in general. So Article 3 is the zoning districts. And so the Article 3 is one of three other main articles that is found within the Land Development Code. So the other two being Article 4, use regulations, and Article 5, general development standards. And so these 5 articles really make up the bulk of what the Land Development Code is and what the Land Development Code does. And so what Article 3 does, sets forth the regulations specific to the zoning districts themselves. And so looking at things like dimensional requirements, the density, so a variety of different elements related to zoning in particular. And so one change within Article 3 related to the zoning districts is having 3 types of districts overall. So one way to think about it is kind of broader categories, which includes the base districts. And so really those are kind of, as they kind of sound, just your normal residential, commercial, industrial, those districts. And then you have your planned development districts, which are really intended to allow greater flexibility, greater innovation for design, to really help or have a quality development that wouldn't otherwise be able to be achieved within the base zoning and other elements. And then you have the third type, which is the overlay district. And it's similar to how the name sounds, where it literally is kind of like a blanket and is overlaid on top of the base district or the planned development district to either add new standards or take standards away from. So you're really looking to either add something or take something away. So really being more restrictive or incentivizing something else through how those standards are applied within the base and planned development districts. And so one of the big changes as it relates to the zoning districts is the overall layout of how everything is set up. And so you can see here, it's going to be more graphically rich with examples, diagrams that specifically show how standards are applied on sites. And so where you find some of these standards, having this tabular format to make it easier to see, make it easier to read, where everything's kind of all together, more graphically rich, having concept images of what some of those developments might look like under that district. And then all of the references to other standards are all in one place. And so looking what we're going to what we have now, where it's pretty much nothing but text. The references to other standards kind of are a little bit circular. You have to flip back and forth in a lot of places to really kind of see what's what. And so just going from what we have now to, or what we're going to, is really a significant departure in terms of the overall look and feel of the code itself. So what are some of these other changes that we're looking at related to the zoning districts as part of Article 3? So one of the big changes is a move to density-based zoning. And so what this does is it removes the minimum lot size standard in place of an overall gross density. And so this tells you that no matter what, you're going to be able to have those 3 units per acre or 6 units per acre or what have you, versus having a minimum lot size that you would have to have. And so what So you're really going to a more true density versus having that minimum lot size. And what this does is it really adds a lot of flexibility for how developments are designed and the way that lots can be set up within a development. And so we do look to retain certain size standards, such as the setbacks. And so there are some of these limitations related to the dimensional standards versus just having just density and nothing else. So one of the other things that we're looking at in terms of refinements is having greater variability across the districts themselves that would allow for more specific context and character development as appropriate. So again, as I mentioned earlier, you get a variety of densities, you get a variety of land uses across the various zoning districts instead of suburban and suburban, where you kind of got suburban, suburban light, and then suburban light. So really having more context, more variability, where you get appropriate character in terms of the area and the place itself. And so some of the other changes that we're looking at is the consolidation in regards to some of the districts within the current code, carrying them forward into new code. And this is because a lot of these districts are very similar in nature. They look to achieve the same thing, allow for the same types of uses. So instead of kind of competing against one of each other, where they're doing very similar purposes, they're kind of combined together into something else that's new. So for instance, the open space is really a consolidation of the PR and TROS districts, where those former districts really did the same exact thing. And so there's no need to have both of those, but kind of taking the best pieces of all of them and morphing them into something new entirely. So similarly, the R3 is kind of a consolidation of two of the older districts. And then the water resources overlay, it's a consolidation of two of the former overlay districts that we had, which really did kind of the same exact thing. And so again, combining and consolidating those into one going forward. Variety of current districts that are existing in the current code are being deleted and not carried forward in any type of way. So particular to this is the RU, the rural district, where we are deleting that district, but we're not getting rid of the rural area, if you will. And so what we're looking to do with it is, the way that development can occur within that district, it's really ineffective and it's not true to the purpose and intent of what the rural district's trying to achieve. And so that name basically serves as a misnomer, where on one end you can get a 500-acre pig farm, but on the other end you can kind of get your standard suburban residential development that you wouldn't expect to see in a rural area. And so deleting a lot of these districts that are really ineffective and don't really serve the purpose of what they try to achieve. And so really looking to replace them in a variety of ways with new districts that are more context and character appropriate. So for instance, the RU, where we are deleting it, replacing it with more rural specific districts, such as the AG, the agricultural district, the HM homesteaded district, and the RT residential transition district in its place, where it would allow for more contextually appropriate development related to the character area in which they operate and exist. So similarly with some of these other districts, things like the manufactured home district really kind of had a very distinct purpose and really wasn't achieving what it was looking to do, mainly related to manufactured homes and mobile home parks. So instead, how can we have those uses be within other zoning districts, but just have different standards related to them within the land use table? So looking at these in a variety of ways of how they work, how they're not being effective and really utilized currently, removing them, and looking at how we replace those with something better in its place. So overall, we're looking at having 28 zoning districts in total, which is very similar to the current amount that we have within our current code. And so here, we just wanted to look at what we're calling zoning equivalencies, or another way to think about it is a translation. So really here, we're looking at the equivalency in terms of context and character of what you could be able to do, or what the old district was looking to achieve, in comparison to the new districts. And so in a lot of cases, the way that these equivalencies are working is it's not always going to be a one-to-one. So it may be in a lot of cases a one-to-many. And then in some cases, you're going to have some districts that are nearly identical to the old district, but are still slightly different overall. And so let me kind of explain how we're looking at some of these. So for instance, the AG is most equivalent in terms of context and character to the RU, because the agricultural district is really intended for larger working lands, very rural areas in that true sense of what we would consider rural. So in terms of the most equivalent old district, the RU would be the most appropriate. Similarly, looking at things like the residential districts, how we're treating the R1, probably most equivalent to the current RSE. So things of that nature in terms of how we're looking at the old, looking at the new, it's equivalent, but it's not the same. And so similarly with some of these other districts, we have some that are very similar, but again, still different enough. And then, as I mentioned, we have some that are still kind of identical. So looking at the LI, light industrial, the way it is set up, the way it functions, it's pretty much the same, but it's different enough because of the general development standards that we're looking at having going forward. So how development looks and how development feels is going to be slightly different than how the current code operates. And then there are, in some cases, as you will see with the corridor mixed use and some of the new planned development districts, these are something that have no true equivalent from the old code to the new code, because the types of development that are able to be achieved within them is a significant difference and departure than development that we'd otherwise be able to do within the current code. And then again, looking at these overlay districts, some of these just kind of see some name changes and some minor revisions, but for the most part are relatively the same. Thinking of the airport height restriction overlay, the floodplain overlay, and the water resources overlay. But then the neighborhood character and the military installation overlay, these are really two new overlay districts that are really going to be significantly different from what we currently have. And then keeping in mind some of these equivalencies, but looking at how some of those densities play out. So the new districts on the left-hand side, the old districts on the right-hand side, and we can kind of compare how some of those densities look, where a lot of them are very similar in nature. Some of them go up, some of them go down slightly. And then again, thinking about some of these more specific districts related to that rural character, seeing significantly decreased densities for what they're looking to accomplish and what they're looking to achieve in terms of that preserving the rural character and having a more true rural place type. Where, for instance, the R1 is much more similar and typical of a suburban development. That is equivalent to really how that RU, that minimum density or that maximum density that would be allowed on it, is equivalent to that R1 currently. And so again, having some of that variation, but again, showing how some of these equivalencies or translations look and feel within the code itself. So going into some of these new districts and what some of these things entail, there are two new districts that really serve to provide a true rural character and context, being the agricultural district or AG and the homestead district HM. And so the HM is one that is new from between the consolidated draft and the public hearing draft, based on comments that we had been receiving and input from the public council stakeholders to really kind of fit this need for another district that wasn't quite agricultural and wasn't quite the residential transition, where we needed something more so in between. And so the AG district is really intended for those rural areas that are more agriculturally centered. So working lands, think forestry, think farming, things of that nature, as well as very low intensity residential uses and some limited commercial and industrial uses that go in concert with those more intense agricultural uses. And so really with it, we're looking at having a 7-acre equivalent in terms of how that density plays out. And then looking at the homestead district, really intended more so for that rural residential character, where it is much more residentially oriented. So homes on very large lots with some small scale agricultural uses along with them. So really intended for hobby farming and some ecotourism uses related to some of those more rural areas. And then looking at some other new districts, we have the corridor mixed use and the community mixed use MU2 and MU3 districts. And really what these are for is to help support quality commercial development along corridors and at activity centers that focus upon walkability, integration of uses, and mixings of uses at relatively intense scales. That's going to really serve as a significant departure from the historic development style for commercial development that we can achieve within the current code. And so really what all that would entail is really kind of trying to build up some of these areas that we really want to focus development on. So looking at these corridors, looking at these really kind of nodes of activity within the county of where we want to see a little bit denser, heavy development related to commercial, residential, and mixing of uses to really kind of build up some of those areas. Other two new districts include the employment district and the institutional district. And so really what the employment district is intended to help facilitate employment type uses related to industrial development, such as production, manufacturing, while all being complementary to more intense residential development and commercial services as well. So really kind of how these can all be commingled in a sense, but is all relating back to facilitating economic development. The INS district is really intended for larger campuses. So looking at things like government facilities, schools, libraries, recreation centers, things of that nature, where you may need a variety of uses all in one site versus having something that would otherwise need multiple zoning districts to facilitate. So rather than having this hodgepodge of zoning districts within this concentrated area, having this one district that allows a broad range of uses while ensuring compatibility internally, as well as compatibility for that surrounding area also. And then looking at the new plan development districts, so here we have the plan development employment campus, and this is really intended for larger site master plan employment parks. So really those economic development projects where you're going to need a variety of uses and variety of development on that one site. And so really one way to think about this is helping to facilitate that kind of company town type of development where you can have your workers all on that one site as part of the overall development and still having some of those service uses related to commercial and the like. And then also another new district being the traditional neighborhood design district. And really what that looks to achieve is having human scaled walkable neighborhoods that provides for kind of these complete communities where you're able to meet all of your everyday needs within where you live in a walkable fashion. So having a mixture of housing types, having a mixture of uses, integrating open space and having more kind of smaller streets that really helps facilitate that kind of neighborhood feel overall. And then some of our other new districts include overlay districts for the neighborhood commercial overlay and the military installation overlay. And so these districts are specifically created to implement the land use policies and recommendations from the comprehensive plan, as well as a variety of the neighborhood master plans. And so the neighborhood character overlay really corresponds directly to a lot of those neighborhood master plans to help preserve and protect some of those neighborhood characteristics that are found within them. And so there's going to be limited applicability for this district in regards to the master plans, but also some of the standards within that district itself on how it can be set up and how it can be applied. And so one thing here that would be in terms of how it could be applied would be the Olympia Mill Village, where that's a National Register district. So it has these historic structures, has this historic character. And so using this overlay to ensure that new development or redevelopment stays in context and character with those historic features that can be found throughout the area. And then we have the military installation overlay, and this is specific to the variety of military bases found throughout the county. So thinking about Fort Jackson, McGrady Training Center, and McIntyre Air National Guard Base to help really look at establishing protections and standards for those installations, such as avoiding and mitigating aircraft obstructions, noise impacts, and overall land use incompatibilities. So really helping ensure the mission operability and viability of those installations for future use. And so really looking at how the bases are impacting that external area, but also how the external areas can be encroaching and impacting on the operability of those installations also. So really taking a lot of those things into consideration, where how can we ensure that everyone is looking at that neighboring ability in terms of how some of those standards are being applied. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Mr. DeLage, who's going to walk us through Article 5, the General Development Standards.
All right, thank you, Mr. Cook. Sorry, a little technical difficulties with getting the unmute to come up, but all right. So the general development standards in our current code are kind of scattered around through some different sections. So what we're doing is consolidating all this into 14 sections, make it a little bit easier to find. So whereas we've been talking about these zoning districts and overlays, and you could think of those as kind of your permissions for each parcel that has a zoning, this is kind of what you have to do as far as for general development across the board. For whenever you're putting up a commercial use or a residential use, mainly larger ones, not really single family ones if on its own little lot, but it does apply to single family development as a combined development. But you can kind of look at these as the standards that are highlighted in red have seen significant changes, mostly modernizations or either additions because of recommendations that came out of the 2015 comprehensive plan and ultimately the code assessment. We also, you can kind of think of it as a medium blue. It's kind of, there's been, some moderate changes, but it's still going to be similar to what we currently have. And then whereas your dark blue is really going to be just, minor refinements, maybe changing a word or adding definitions there, here or there throughout those sections. Next slide, please, sir. All right, so some of the big changes, access mobility, and then of course connectability or connectivity. So we're looking at those external street connections. So trying to ensure that developments have adequate access points rather than just one. Some actually providing for new provisions based on the number of units as to the number of required access points for new residential subdivisions as well as for commercials. Also looking at cul-de-sac restrictions. So idea being that is that you don't have one long cul-de-sac with just a bunch of other cul-de-sacs attached to it. So we're discouraging those. And then also planning for that adjacent development that will be coming, whether it be within the next few years or the next 10, there's provisions for adding connectivity by not having the street stubs to adjacent parcels. So that way you're not having to get out onto a major road basically to get to the next door property. Also within subdivisions and certain developments, you have the connectivity index. So you're looking at your nodes, you're looking at your links and how those are laid out. And the idea behind that is, again, not that having that big long cul-de-sac. So you're going to have different block links, different ways to connect with internal to a development. They also, again, big thing that cross access between. So again, those stubs that we were talking about. So as you can see, that it applies for commercial or residential. And then of course, pedestrian connections. So we're looking at providing sidewalks If you got external sidewalks and you got internal sidewalks, trying to provide as much connectivity. So maybe you're not having to walk down all the way down the road and then to get to an external sidewalk if you've got a portion of your property that connects to an external sidewalk. Next, please. So modernizing our off-street parking and loading standards was a big deal. The code is 15 plus years old. You have to figure the adoption date plus a few years of work before that. So additional research has been done on new standards. New uses have been even come along that weren't even envisioned back when this code was adopted. Pervious materials, pervious pavers, other best practices have been invented and updated, so including those as much as possible into the plan. Also, our mitigation for some of those requirements. So parking that exceeds mid-max range in our current code has certain mitigation standards. Those have been simplified and made a little bit easier to understand what would be required when you hit some of those thresholds. We've also looked at, in some instances where it makes sense to eliminate minimum parking requirements, allow the business to determine the minimum, but having maximums on that. So again, the idea is to discourage very large seas of asphalt for parking. Also looking at new mixed use calculations for those developments that have multiple tenants. So think of your barbershop, think of your retail store, and then maybe have an office. Well, we have a one size fit all now for those uses, whereas this new mixed use calculation takes those individually into consideration, again, to provide better parking ratios or required parking ratios for that, so you're not having to overdevelop the property. Also, there is off-street parking or deferred parking. Basically what that is it provides flexibility that if you can demonstrate that because of the way your particular use functions and you've got street parking, that you don't need to require as much on-site. It provides, again, flexibility to those developers and builders. Also, stacking spaces have been refined. And what we're talking about when we're talking about stacking is you've got vehicles that are queued up essentially for drive-throughs, whether that be restaurant, bank. But the idea is that by refining those and updating those, you're ensuring that cars are not backing up to a point to where they're actually backing out and queuing up into a public road or right of way. Also, our bicycle parking standards have been consolidated, and additional information has been added to those as far as for, kind of what the recommendations are for racks, locations, things of that nature. Also, transportation demand management is a new one. Again, that kind of gets into that off-site or deferred parking. You can take portions of that into your plan into consideration to reduce your parking. So think of your office building that, maybe they have 15% of the people work remote. They have a ride share program. They're located on a transit stop. So all that stuff can be kind of used to help reduce the parking requirements. Next slide, please. So landscaping, so new requirements regarding maintenance, also requirements for species diversity, whereas our current code, you could basically, if you meet a medium maturing tree, you could have the same maturing tree throughout there, which could lead up potentially to issues with any kind of fungus or mold or disease. Also looking at transitional buffer yard standards being kind of simplified. We have a chart now that is a little bit difficult to use. If you're this use and you're considered a heavy impact and that you're adjacent to a light impact, then you've got to do this particular buffer, and it's like A, B, or C. But this simplifies that. Also looks at those street protective yards and then also the parking lot landscaping standards. So the idea behind that is by changing that, making that a little bit easier. It'll provide screening, visual screening from public road or right of way to say your parking lots. There's also minimum planning requirements, as you can see in the graphic on the right corner. There's now screening provided around to that footprint of that building. Again, just to break up, some of those buildings and that development from adjacent public roads or right of ways. Also looked at strengthening some of the tree protection standards. So right now, you're looking for your grand tree with a certain diameter at breast height. Now this provides additional, so it may not necessarily be a grand tree, but it could be another tree that is, of a certain diameter that traditionally now, you could remove without having to do mitigation. Or, even if it was within a required buffer yard, you could take out and just do a plantings as a 6-to-1 ratio. Now this is kind of strengthened that. to encourage the use of more of that natural vegetation. Next slide, please. So another big change is our open space set aside. So currently the open space set asides in our code can be utilized in conjunction with our open space development standards. So in exchange for relaxing lot size. Now in our new code that we're recommending adoption is going to be standard across all base districts. So we look at, in particular, we look at those standards as far as so you can't necessarily just do a strip, call that your open space, and then, you know, that you meet your requirements. So there are standards that are related to kind of how that's laid out, you know, what counts. You know, it also talks about maintenance and ownership. So making sure that basically when it gets turned over, when that development is done and completed, that the HOA, POA, or some other kind of entity is going to own it, so it doesn't add costs to the county. And then also for those natural features that kind of count towards those open space, what's currently in there is things like floodplain, natural features, looking at recreation areas. And then, of course, we're recommending as part of the open space set aside standards, including those landscaping and buffer yards as well. Next slide, please. So this is new. So as an option to develop within the more rural zoning districts, our newly created rural zoning districts. So think of your AG district or your MH district, allowing for cluster development, with the theory being that you can develop in some of those, you know, prime agricultural areas, but ensuring that it is character and contextually appropriate. So basically allowing for a buffer between the street and then where the residential starts. So again, so you're not just driving down the road and all of a sudden you just come up on a row of houses that are clustered right next to it. So the idea would be to have buffer in the front. You would go in, cluster your houses, and then the rest of the site would be undeveloped. And that's also going to help reduce costs for infrastructure when it comes to roads, drainage, and any kind of required buffer yards. Also, again, it's a way to reduce those capital costs and preserve more land. Next slide, please. So design and form standards. So these kind of come into place into the mixed use districts. So think of your major road corridors. It's basically to make sure that any kind of development that goes in there or redevelopment is going to contribute to a greater livability and sustainability. So again, in these areas, you've got mixes of uses. So there's residential, commercial, office, but it looks at more form-based necessarily. So kind of how those buildings are laid out, facades, spacing, kind of your roof pitches, and then in general orientation. Next slide. So neighborhood compatibility standards and agricultural compatibility standards. So while we have some that were in a previous overlay district for neighborhood compatibility, these new standards are designed to go similarly like the previous, or the one that we have in place now, as to protect those neighborhoods essentially by providing form-based recommendations for development and redevelopment. So it applies to the non-residential districts. And then the idea is that so you don't have very, you know, stark differences in development. So take Decker Boulevard, for example. So if you're familiar with it, it's a very long commercial kind of corridor. It comes off of Two Notch Road. On either side of Decker is residential. So, I mean, you might have commercial that lines Decker, but right beside it is residential. So the idea would be is that you would get a gradation of intensity of uses. So if you developed a big commercial building, the idea would not be have a 3-story building and then right next to a 1-story single family residential, you know, structure. So if you can see in the graphic that's down at the bottom, you kind of have a gradation. So you get your, like, in theory, redevelop, you could have your single family, and then it kind of migrates into maybe it's a 2-family or an office use, and then it gets to your commercial. So again, it's to protect those existing neighborhoods. Agricultural compatibility is a big one. So again, in a way to allow for development within the more rural parts of the county, but also to protect those working lands from residential encroachment. So with the agricultural compatibility, a buffer would be put in place that buffer is to provide a separation. So that working farm that maybe creates that noise, that dust, that odor wouldn't have as big of effect as if there was a residence right on the property line. So the idea would be you've got your agricultural use, you've got a buffer that separates it, and then in character with that, large acreage or that large working farm, you get a little bit larger residential lots. And then as you move down towards that required buffer along that road right away, the lot size can shrink down to whatever the minimum standard is for the particular district that it is zoned. Next slide, please. So the green development incentives have been incorporated, whereas we had some that could be considered green development incentives prior to. This takes it a little bit further. So we look at certification standards such as like CHIP and LEED, and using those to kind of through a menu-based approach to actually achieve certain incentives that would get you to incorporate maybe a mini split unit where appropriate, where it'll meet those requirements. Rather than having an HVAC unit, or to basically take gray water and use it for irrigation. But it's a menu-based approach. And the idea is that if you take so let's just say for increasing your building height, you want to do that. You got to do, two pieces out of, or two things out of column A, and then maybe one out of column B. And I'm just using that as hypothetical. There's specific requirements for those that go along with that. Once you do that, whatever those three are, they're not cumulative. So if you want to say reduce your parking requirements, then you'd have to do whatever is required on that to be able to achieve that. So you can't double dip. But ideally, some of these incentives like the building height, residential density increases, setback reductions, will kind of encourage folks to take advantage of that. Next slide, please. So, and then kind of leading into Mr. Crook's section, so articles with minor changes. So looking at those use regulations, basically we kind of refined how they're organized. So we kind of gone to a classification category type. So thinking like agricultural, and then you kind of get into your specifics of that, and then your permission types. So looking at the, whether it's permitted use, permitted by special requirement, or permitted by special exception, which is the appearance before the Board of Zoning Appeals, refine those where they've made sense, added new uses where they made sense, removed old uses where they make sense, and then also provided definitions within the code. So again, you're not having to go to the land development code, say, okay, all right, we referenced the NAICS previously, so let me go get the NAICS. Well, this is the wrong one. It's actually referencing the older one. It's a 2002. So we've eliminated that and made it easier. So if you need a definition for a use, it can be found within the Land Development Code. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Crooks.
Thanks, Tommy. So we're going to go through some more of these other articles with some of those minor changes. So Article 6, which is the land development subdivision standards. Two of the big changes here is really looking at referencing the need for compliance with the land development manual. And what that is it's really a separate document for how the site development process occurs. So looking at things related to stormwater, site grading, so really a lot of things related to the engineering side of that development process. And so really referencing the need to comply with some of those standards that are going to be found within that document. And then another one of the changes is really reducing the size for a minimum and maximum lengths of blocks as part of a residential development. And so really reducing those numbers so you don't have these large, long blocks throughout a subdivision, but having more smaller, manageable, walkable blocks that are within those instead. And then Article 7 is an article that deals with nonconformities. And so there's been a couple of kind of minor changes here, one of which is to centralize language regarding nonconformities into one single article. So currently, language regarding nonconformities can be found throughout a variety of sections within the current code, and really looking to bring all of those into one section overall. So if you're looking for information about what constitutes a nonconformity and what all of that entails, you'll be able to go to this one article and find that information specifically, versus having to search through signage versus and other areas within the code. You'll just be able to look in that one place. And so another thing that we've done related to nonconformities is add in flexibility for parking and landscaping related to bringing items into conformity. And so where we have things like a change of use, so we're going from one business to the other, that would require maybe having more landscaping or new parking that has to be added as part of that use. And so instead of having to, add 20 new parking spaces onto a site that may not necessarily fit, it allows for greater flexibility in order to ensure compliance with the code as part of that conformity being brought into. And so looking at a variety of things related to those specific to parking and landscaping, adding some of that flexibility and variability with how that compliance can be met. And then Article 9 deals with definitions, rules of construction, and rules of measurement. And so one of the important things here is really having a more graphically rich article. So where in the current code, we really just have terms and a description for those terms, looking at how some of those things actually look. So when we're talking about the measuring of a block length, okay, here's a diagram that actually shows you how that would work. Similarly, when we're talking about what some of these setbacks are and what those setbacks, how they look, well, here's a diagram for that. Same way in terms of looking at things like the types of lots that can be found. So when we're describing a corner lot, well, here's a visual of what we mean, or same way with a through lot. Well, here's what that through lot entails versus just giving you that textual description. We also give you a graphic description within the code. And so one of the things that Mr. DeLage mentioned previously as it relates to those land uses is all of those are now defined specifically within Article 9 under the definitions section. And so in addition to those land uses, we also have a variety of terms or concepts that have definitions within this. So things like what constitutes a grand tree and what all that entails, that's found within the definitions section within Article 9. And then another point to note related to this is the delegation of authority to professional level staff. So if we, thinking back to that summary of responsibility table and summary of responsibilities and duties table back in Article 2 under the administration article, where we have listed the zoning administrator, planning director, or other kind of positions or titles, how those responsibilities can be delegated. So for instance, about sign permits, where that's a review and decision that is delegated to the zoning administrator, well, that might be something that a zoning analyst handles instead, where they're the ones that are reviewing that document, issuing the approval, instead of it specifically being the zoning administrator or whoever's listed there every single time. And so it really just goes back to that delegation of authority related to the appropriate staff members. And with that, that is really the information that we're wanting to go over today, really kind of talking about some of those highlights in various elements. And so at the moment, no messages in our chat box in the Zoom, and I will check the YouTube comment box in a second also, but in the event that we don't have any comments or questions currently, you can also send further comments and questions directly to Mr. DeLage or myself at our information listed here on the slide. So our emails are both there. You can also call the planning department at 576-2190 with any questions or comments or wanting to discuss the code. Same way, if you want to provide comments directly through the project website, you can do that also. Same way with finding a copy of the code, you can find it on the project website or on the county's website as well. And so as I mentioned earlier, you are able to schedule one-on-one meetings if you have questions or are wanting to get clarification on some things. That is also an option that folks can take advantage of. And so still don't see any comments within the chat bar. And so let me
as well
go check in the YouTube. And I know there's usually a slight minute or so delay with it. But but I don't see
Anyway, if you want
anything.
to provide comments directly through the project website, you can do
So
that.
I think
also.
with that,
Same
we
way.
will be concluding the meeting. So for those of you who are watching us, we appreciate your time. We appreciate you being engaged and learning more about the code rewrite. And again, any additional questions or comments or looking for information, you can find that at the information listed here at the bottom of the slide. And we thank you for your time today, and we hope you have a great rest of your evening and look forward to you staying engaged as part of the code rewrite process.